At the company's couples party, I saw my wife arrive with a strange man, so I went up to them and said to her, "I thought you loved me, but you just destroyed everything for a single moment, you'll regret it when the divorce letter comes for you." She remained serious, motionless, as if the impact of my words had torn some hidden nerve inside her. But at that moment, not even her silence surprised me. What destroyed me was her gaze. It wasn't a gaze of guilt, nor of pain, nor even of regret. It was empty. A hole where there used to be affection. A hole where there used to be the two of us. And there, in the middle of a room full of artificial lights, fake laughter and glasses of expensive wine, I realized that love dies silently. It doesn't scream, it doesn't fight, it doesn't ask for help. It just stops breathing. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't move. She just stood next to that man as if she already belonged to another world. And I, who for years had built dreams with her, who had turned our promises into routine, who had accepted the weight of the difficult days believing it was just a phase, was discarded as if I were the mistake she needed to get rid of. And the cruelest thing was that she looked at me as if she were right. As if I was the one who was exaggerating. As if my broken heart was a minor inconvenience on that night of plasticized smiles. But I swear that at that moment, with my blood boiling and the lump in my throat tearing my voice, I felt a decision being born inside me. A strange, silent force that told me, "You will still be thankful for this moment." And in that moment, for the first time in years, I believed in myself. I drove home alone. And the silence in the car felt more welcoming than the last few dinners with her. In the days that followed, the noise of betrayal wouldn't leave my head. It wasn't just about another man. It was about the abandonment that started long before him. It was about the ignored signs, the lukewarm apologies, the absent glances in the middle of entire conversations. It was about realizing that she had already left long before that party. What happened there was just the formalization of the end. And yet, it hurt as if I had been stabbed that night. Sleeping was almost impossible. Eating, an effort. Working, torture. But I knew that the worst wasn't now. The worst would come later. When she received the letter. When she realized that she was no longer the owner of my life. When she understood that what she thought she had as a plan B was going away. Because she thought I would never have the courage. That I would be content to be the fool who forgives everything. But no. Not this time. Not with this coldness. Not after everything I had given of myself. The letter arrived for her on an ordinary morning. Cold. Silent. The white envelope, discreet, almost cynical, seemed to have no weight at all. But inside it, there was everything. Every swallowed tear. Every sleepless night. Every lie tolerated. Every frustrated hope. There it was, in those formal and dry words, the confirmation that she had lost me. Forever. And the most surprising thing? When she read it, her smile died. For the first time, she felt something that even she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was loss. And the shock came like an avalanche. She had underestimated me. She had discarded me as if it were easy. But now she was the one who was out. She was the one who no longer knew how to return. She was the one who looked at the emptiness of the house and heard the echo of her own decisions. For weeks, she tried to pretend to be strong. She pretended to others that everything was fine, that the relationship was already worn out, that it was better this way. But deep down, something started to fall apart. Because the man she got involved with was not what she had idealized. He was not stable. He was not sensitive. He was not present. He was the opposite of everything she had with me. And she only realized this too late. Because when the dazzlement wore off, what was left was regret. And this one, has no instruction manual. Regret corrodes in silence, appears in the small hours, in the sleepless nights, in the banal details that remind her of what was lost. She started looking for me with her eyes, even though she knew I was no longer around. She started looking through old photos, rereading saved messages, remembering things she once despised. That was when the silence turned into torment. An absence, punishment. But I didn't look back. Because at the same time that she was drowning in longing, I was being reborn. I discovered that loneliness has much less to do with being alone than with being with someone who no longer sees you. And, without her, I began to see myself again. I went back to doing the things I loved. Talking to people she had pushed away. Smiling for real. And one day, without planning, I met someone. A light, honest presence, without games, without masks. A woman who asked me for nothing more than my truth. And it was like that, without warning, that I realized that love still existed, it just wasn't where I insisted on keeping it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, she watched my new life on social media. He saw my sincere smile. He saw the places we used to go together, now frequented by me and someone else. He saw that, despite everything, I managed to move on. And that, despite everything, she was left behind. But the most unexpected thing was yet to come. Because a few days later, she tried to come back. She tried, as if pretending that nothing was so serious. She sent messages. He showed up at places I used to go. He called me in the middle of the night. He wanted to talk, cry, explain himself. He said it was a mistake. He didn't know what he was doing. That the other person wasn't what she thought. That he missed me. But time is cruel to those who waste what they have. And at that moment, what she wanted wasn't love. It was forgiveness for her own ego. It was reparation for her own guilt. But I had already learned. I learned that love that drags on is not worth love that is reborn. And even though it still hurt in some corner of my soul, I knew that the right thing to do was to keep the door closed. And now she lives with her own ghosts. She tries to move on with her life, but she carries the burden of having destroyed something that she only now understands the value of. She lives surrounded by silences, by regrets disguised as routine. And me? I found the peace that she stole from me for so long. I found a new version of myself. One that no longer needs to beg for love, or fight to be seen. One that learned that, sometimes, losing someone is the greatest liberation one can have. But what she doesn't know yet is that the biggest lesson of her life is about to happen. Because the day she finds out who her ex-husband rebuilt his life with will be the same day she will understand, with tears in her eyes, that it is not time that heals. It is the truth that sets you free. And this truth will turn her world upside down. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, we believe that loyalty is the basis, and respect is the rule. All the stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths. The moral is clear: betrayal destroys, it hurts and leaves marks that not even time can erase. Now, take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear is a shocking story, heart-wrenching and stomach-turning. Brace yourself. The truth will hurt. Marcus has always been a man with a calm soul, someone who listened more than he spoke, who thought before reacting, who carried a rare kind of calm in his eyes that made even those around him slow down. He grew up in a simple neighborhood in Charlotte, where neighbors knew each other by name and doors were open in the summer. The son of a teacher and an electrician, he learned early on that respect was non-negotiable and that love, when true, required effort, patience and presence. He was always the kind of person who didn't ask for anything that he himself wasn't willing to give. When she decided to get married, she did it with conviction. With the certainty of someone who sees in the other person not only what she loves, but also what she is willing to face to keep. And that was how, after 3 years of dating, he walked down the aisle with the woman he had long believed was his best choice. Her name was Isabelle. With a striking presence and sharp intelligence, she was the kind of woman who didn't go unnoticed. She worked as a project manager for a multinational company and was always eager to grow, to stand out, to show that she was capable. Coming from a more reserved and demanding family, Isabelle grew up hearing that she couldn't make mistakes, that she needed to be impeccable in everything, all the time. Over time, this became part of her identity, and also of her insecurity. When she met Marcus, what caught her attention the most was the way he listened to her, as if every word she said was important, as if there was no rush. With him, she could take off her armor. That's why she stayed. That's why she said yes. And that's why they built a life together. Their home was a reflection of the union of their two worlds. Every detail, from the plants on the porch to the paintings in the hallway, had a bit of both. On weekends, she took care of the household finances while he prepared breakfast. They made lists for the supermarket, watched thrillers on cold nights and had the habit of walking together in the park at dusk. At first glance, they were an exemplary couple. Close friends envied the partnership they built, and even when the conversations revolved around the challenges of life together, Marcus and Isabelle always seemed in tune. They had crises like any other couple, but they always ended with long conversations in the kitchen, after the dishes were done, with her sitting on the counter and him leaning against the wall, crossing his arms as he listened to every nuance of what she said. Over time, the routine became more established, and along with it came new challenges. She started to be promoted within the company, and this meant more hours away from home, more commitments, more travel. He, on the other hand, chose to keep his position at a local school as a guidance counselor. Not for lack of ambition, but by choice. He wanted stability, time for life, and presence for the wedding. In her eyes, sometimes this choice seemed like complacency. But he saw it as a way to find balance. He understood that they were different, and he never tried to extinguish Isabelle's flame, even when she seemed so distant that he had to stretch to reach her. He admired her. And that, for him, was enough. At dinners at home, she would talk about important meetings, goals, and numbers. He would listen, sincerely, even when he didn't understand all the acronyms or dynamics of the corporate world. He would talk about the students he helped, the families he helped, the thank you letters he received, and she would listen, but sometimes with distraction. It became more common to see her on her cell phone during conversations, answering messages while he was telling her something, or rushing off to yet another company event. Marcus didn't complain. He believed that love also meant knowing how to give up one's own time so that the other person could expand. He thought that this phase would pass. That Isabelle would soon find her balance. But what he didn't know was that she was already starting to live at a different pace, one that no longer included the pause he offered her. Even so, in the eyes of most people, they continued to be the perfect couple. They were constantly complimented. "You two are so balanced," they would say. "You can tell you were made for each other." He would smile lightly whenever he heard that. She would smile too, but her gaze was already beginning to look in other directions. Still, there was no conflict. There was no confrontation. Just a disguised absence of normality. Marcus continued to be as careful as ever. Birthdays never went by without notes hidden in her purse. The car was filled with gas without her asking. Sunday breakfast was sacred. She, on the other hand, was slowly replacing details with deadlines. Gestures with agendas. Moments with goals. And every time she arrived late, with a tense smile and tired eyes, he would receive her patiently, thinking that it was all part of the effort for the future. But it wasn't just the weather that changed. It was the tone. Conversations, once deep, now revolved around obligations. Glances, once lingering, became quick. Touches, once spontaneous, became occasional. He began to feel the weight of loneliness even when he was with someone. A kind of emptiness that was hard to explain. That feeling of being in the same room, but in different worlds. Still, Marcus resisted the idea that something could be wrong. He believed that true love was also made of difficult times. He remembered how she cried on his shoulder when her father got sick. How she laughed non-stop on improvised trips. How she stayed silent by his side and still felt present. He clung to those memories. Because that's what he did, he believed in what he built. He wasn't the type to give up easily. Isabelle, in turn, immersed in meetings and goals, began to feel that domestic life was too small for her flights. Not in an arrogant way, but restless. She wanted more. More experiences. More excitement. More recognition. And, without realizing it, she began to compare. Not verbally. Not directly. But she compared. The clothes, the conversations, the projects. She compared the excitement of new environments with the tranquility that Marcus offered. She compared the adrenaline of work with the routine of home. She compared his silence full of tenderness with the provocative dialogues she had outside. And, without wanting to, she began to build an internal narrative in which he was the static one and she, the one who needed to move forward. But there was still no break. There were still dinners. There were still birthdays remembered. There were still moments shared, even if they were increasingly rare. One night, during a seemingly trivial conversation on the porch, Marcus mentioned his desire to take a short trip together. Something simple. A weekend away, just the two of them. Isabelle hesitated. She said that her schedule was tight. That maybe it wasn't the right time. He smiled, understanding, but something in him broke into silence. A kind of tiredness that wasn't physical. It was emotional. It was the weight of realizing that this was no longer the same place. That their love was perhaps getting lost between the lines. But he didn't say anything. He believed that, with time and patience, everything would get back on track. After all, they were married. And marriage, for him, was about commitment until the end. So he carried on. He carried on with the small kindnesses, with the silent hugs, with the attempts to get closer. He carried on with faith. And Isabelle. Isabelle followed too. But in another direction. Without him realizing it, she was already beginning to follow a path that was gradually excluding him. A path where choices no longer considered him, where plans no longer included him. And all of this happened softly, almost imperceptibly. But it was there. In the tone of her voice. In the rush of her days. In the absence of questions about how he was. It was in the details. And it was precisely because it was so subtle that it took Marcus so long to notice. But he would notice. And when he realized, everything would change. That Monday dawned with clear skies and a light breeze that seemed to promise a peaceful day, but what was happening behind the walls of that silent house was already carrying accumulated storms. Marcus had woken up earlier than usual, drank coffee alone and left a cup for Isabelle, as he always did when she slept in. There was an emptiness dragging the minutes on the clock, something he couldn't name, but he felt it growing inside his chest. In the last few days, her absences had started to be longer, colder, more justified by last-minute commitments that hadn't existed before. The clothes she wore began to be taken care of differently, her makeup became more intense, her perfume sweeter and lingered. He noticed everything, but said nothing. He swallowed his intuition like someone taking bitter medicine, hoping that it was just his own exaggeration. He continued to carry out his routine with forced lightness, offering calm smiles even when his heart began to ache in anticipation. Dinners at home became solitary. Isabelle started arriving late, saying she was overwhelmed, that the new leadership required more dedication, that this phase was crucial for the next leap in her career. Marcus listened to her attentively, as he always did, but something in the tone of her words seemed rehearsed. There were no longer pauses for long hugs or questions about how he was. What was once natural became protocol, and their contact became mechanical, as if they shared the same house only for convenience. And yet, he continued to believe that it was just a phase. That true love required resistance. That sometimes you have to go through zones of silence to find connection again. He insisted, day after day, on the small gestures, a flower left in the kitchen, a message in the middle of the afternoon, an invitation to watch that movie she had always loved together. But her answers were short, her smiles were rare, her eyes were always elsewhere. Isabelle, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly opaque at home, but she shone outside. Always impeccable in social engagements, with an easy laugh and convincing speeches, she spent most of her days involved in corporate events, dinners with colleagues, and short last-minute trips. To everyone, she was the image of a successful woman, admired for maintaining a stable marriage despite a demanding career. But inside, what was growing in her was not fulfillment, it was doubt. The marriage that had once strengthened her now seemed like an invisible obstacle. She would not admit it out loud, but the feeling that accompanied her when she got home was no longer one of comfort. It was guilt. And it was precisely this guilt that made her avoid Marcus's eyes. Because there, in his eyes, there was still love. And that, at that moment, hurt more than any rejection. The messages exchanged between her and her new co-worker started out harmlessly. They were about projects, meetings, and deliverables. Then came the subtle compliments, the out-of-context conversations, and the laughter at inappropriate times. Before she knew it, she was already waiting for the notifications. He had already created a new password on his phone. She found herself fixing her hair before video chatting with him. It was as if, little by little, a part of her was disconnecting from the life she had built and letting herself be guided by a sense of newness that made her feel wanted, alive, outside the invisible prison she believed she was living in. Isabelle was not a bad woman. She never was. But she was a confused woman who didn't know how to ask for help when she felt the ground slipping away from her. And instead of talking, she chose escape. Instead of confrontation, she chose secrecy. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew her details. He knew how to tell a real smile from a polite one. He knew when she was there and when she was just pretending to be. He noticed when her touch changed. When her hugs became formal. When her kisses lost their flavor. He knew. He had no proof, but he knew. And this silent knowledge was even more painful than a confession. He began to observe in silence. Every unexplained exit, every phone turned upside down, every excuse repeated too often. He didn't make a fuss, he just recorded it. Because part of him still wanted to be wrong. Part of him wanted to believe it was just a crisis. That she would come back. That everything would go back to the way it was before. But another part was already preparing for the fall. The invitation to the company party came as a subtle warning that something was about to happen. It was a traditional event, where couples were expected, and where Marcus' presence was always requested by her colleagues. But that year, Isabelle hesitated to invite him. She said it would be more technical, that there would be no room for companions, that perhaps it would be better if he didn't go. But he insisted. He said he needed to get out for a while, that he wanted to see her in her own environment. She agreed, reluctantly. And that night, Marcus calmly got ready, put on the same perfume she had praised, straightened his shirt collar, and went to meet her with a heavy heart. The room was full of lights, well-dressed people, clinking glasses, artificial smiles. But in the midst of so many appearances, what he saw was something he hadn't expected. She arrived with another man. Time stood still for a few seconds. There was no room for doubt or explanation. She didn't see him right away. He was holding hands with someone who clearly wasn't a colleague. The gestures were too intimate. The glances, too long. And in that instant, something inside Marcus collapsed. It wasn't anger he felt. It was betrayal. Pure. Raw. Unvarnished. It was the realization that while he was struggling alone to keep them both standing, she had already chosen another path. He approached with firm steps. The room suddenly seemed quieter. And when he stood before her, she saw him. And all she could do was swallow hard. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just looked into her eyes and said, in the calmest and most lethal voice she had ever heard, "I thought you loved me, but you just destroyed everything for a single moment. You'll regret it when the divorce papers arrive for you." And then he turned his back and walked away. She remained there, paralyzed, with the other man by her side, trying to understand the dimension of what had just happened. But her realization would only begin to sink in over the following days. Marcus, at that moment, no longer had any doubts. He only had decisions to make. And while she tried to put out the fire that she herself had started, he, for the first time in a long time, breathed the air of a man who understood his own value. But she didn't know yet that the worst was yet to come. The envelope had been delivered 2 days earlier, with the same coldness with which she had destroyed everything. It was white, simple, but its contents carried the weight of everything she had never imagined losing. When Isabelle opened it and read each line of that document, her eyes could not follow the words to the end. It was official. It was final. It was real. The divorce was not a threat, it was a sentence. A response. A reaction to what she thought she controlled. She stood there for a long time staring at the paper, as if she could change something just by looking at it. As if there were an undo button. But there was none. The time for hesitation was over. And now all that was left was the echo of what she had not said, of what she had not explained, of what she had abandoned. The first night after the letter was silent and cruel. Alone, in the apartment she had chosen when she decided to leave home, Isabelle felt for the first time the impact of what she had done. Before, there had been noise, movement, distraction. Now, all that remained was the weight of an irreparable mistake. In the following days, she tried to contact him. Unanswered calls. Messages that were viewed without a response. Emails that returned with silence. Marcus's absence was deafening, but what consumed her was not just the distance, it was the way he simply excluded her without leaving a trace of bitterness, without shouting, without begging for explanations. He simply withdrew from the narrative with such painful dignity that it made her feel even smaller. The man she was with, the one with whom she swore she was living a new phase, no longer seemed so interesting. The conversations lacked depth. The laughter was forced. The silences were too long. And worse, he didn't know her details. He didn't know her favorite coffee, or the reason why she cried watching old movies. He didn't know how to touch her hands. He didn't offer peace. He offered distraction. But now, not even that was enough. And it was like that, in this emotional limbo, that she began to sink into regret. Meanwhile, Marcus wasn't just recovering. He was rediscovering himself. He began to fill his days with new experiences, meeting people that time had taken away from him, rebuilding small rituals that he once shared with someone who no longer deserved to be by his side. He didn't talk about what had happened. He didn't seek revenge, nor harbor anger. He simply put himself in the place he always deserved to be. Strong, centered, whole. And in this new space of silence and healing, someone appeared. It wasn't planned. It wasn't quick. It was natural. An old childhood friend, who had returned to the city to take care of her sick mother, found in Marcus the same warmth that he always remembered from his youth. And he, without realizing it, found in her what he never imagined he would find again, serenity, truth, and a look that demanded nothing more than presence. Over time, the bond grew. And in little more than a month, the two were already sharing coffee, laughter, and walks. It was different. It was light. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled without carrying pain behind his eyes. Isabelle found out about this by chance. A mutual friend mentioned that she had seen him at a restaurant with another woman. She said they seemed close. Happy. And that comment, almost innocent, hit her like a blade. She tried to act indifferent, tried to maintain her pride, but when she got home, her whole body was shaking. She went straight to his profile on social media, which had previously been discreet, almost erased, and saw a new post. A simple, unposed photo of him next to a smiling woman, in a park. The caption was short, but it said it all: peace is when love doesn't hurt. She couldn't describe what she felt. It was a mix of envy, anger, guilt, longing, and a sadness that dragged her body to the ground. She lost. Not just the man, but everything he represented. And at that moment, despair became her driving force. She decided to look for him. She sent messages more intensely, used a friend's phone, left a message at the school where he worked. Until one day, he answered. His voice was firm, but not cold. She, on the other end of the line, couldn't keep her composure. She asked to see him. She said she needed to explain. That she didn't want to get back together, but she needed to say something important. He hesitated. But he accepted. And they arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, where, years before, they used to drink hot chocolate on winter afternoons. When he arrived, she was already seated. Her eyes red, her hands restless. The silence between them lasted longer than any words could fill. But it was he who spoke first. He said he was fine. That he didn't hate her. That he wanted her to find peace. Isabelle lowered her eyes, took a deep breath and began. She said she had made a mistake. That she didn't know how to deal with her own dissatisfaction. That she had sought outside what she should have resolved within. And that nothing she had experienced after the end had made sense. He just listened. Without interruptions. Without anger. Without apparent hurt. And then she said she needed to confess something. Something she could no longer keep inside. She looked into his eyes, with heavy tears, and revealed that the man she had betrayed him with was not just a colleague or someone who had happened by chance. He was someone who had been indirectly present in Marcus's life for a long time. Someone who had attended company events for years. Someone who, in the past, had presented himself as a friend. The man Isabelle had gotten involved with was, in fact, a former college colleague of Marcus's. A man who, years ago, had shared work, confidences, dreams with him. A man Marcus had recommended for an internship program when he took on the position of advisor at a local university. A man to whom Marcus had reached out when he needed it most, offering contacts, recommendations, support. And Isabelle knew this. She had always known it. And yet, she chose to cross that line. Marcus was immediately shocked. His body stiffened, his eyes blinked slowly, as if he were trying to process an impact beyond the emotional. He rested his hands on the table as if he needed to anchor himself. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. And when he did speak, his voice was low, firm, wounded. He asked her how long she had known. She replied that she had known since the beginning. And that even so, she had chosen to remain silent. She said it was an escape. That she hadn't measured the consequences. That she was confused. But he would no longer listen to excuses. What hurt now was not just the marital betrayal. It was the betrayal of two sides. Of two bonds. It was the breaking of two pacts. The breaking of friendship and union. It was the collapse of a complete circle of trust. He stood up, took a deep breath, and looked at her one last time. He said that forgiveness was not an obligation. And that she would have to learn to live with what she had lost, not because of a mistake, but because of a conscious choice. She tried to stand up, grab his arm, say something else, but he was already gone. And while she stood there, sunk in the truth she herself had brought to light, Marcus walked away. Not with hate. But with the peace of someone who, for the first time, understood that he had not been left behind because he was insufficient. He had been freed because he was too whole to continue being divided. And deep down, even amidst the pain that now burned in silence, she knew she would never have him back. And the cruelest thing was knowing that the one who destroyed everything, was her. The afternoon wind blew hard that Thursday, as if it wanted to tear everything that was still loose from the ground. Marcus walked slowly down a different street, further away, where the noise of the cars seemed to not reach and the tall trees hid the rush of the world. He had left the cafe minutes ago, but he could still smell the regret in the air, impregnated on his skin, on his palate. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, as if his body needed time to absorb what he had just heard. He refused to touch his face, to run his fingers over his eyes, as if that way he could contain any visible sign of the pain that was creeping through the cracks. The ground seemed harder, the sky grayer, and everything around him carried an invisible layer of silence that no one could break. On the outside, he continued with the same impenetrable expression he had cultivated since the beginning, but on the inside, an intense battle was taking place. A confrontation between everything he believed to be fair and the silent destruction of everything he had trusted. He stopped in front of an old record store, where he used to go when he needed to remember who he was before his marriage. He looked in the window and saw the reflection of a different man than he had been months ago. No longer the patient husband who waited for reconciliation in silence, but someone who had faced the worst of love and still hadn't let go. That revelation crushed him on a level that even he couldn't describe, but it also brought brutal clarity. It was never about him not being enough, but about her not knowing how to value who he was. A friend from his youth, someone he trusted and helped to get back on his feet, now represented the end of a story that he had tried to save alone. And the worst of all was the realization that Isabelle had never been deceived, never been taken without knowing it. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she chose to continue. She knew who he was, she knew the past they shared, she knew the weight of that gesture, and yet she crossed the line. That night, he didn't go home. He went to a remote hotel, where he turned off his cell phone and lay there for hours staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. There were no more tears, no more anger, just exhaustion. A kind of tiredness that came from deep within the soul, from someone who had carried an entire marriage alone for too long. Marcus thought about every detail that now seemed small, but was revealing. The times she had been too silent, when he had asked for affection and had been rushed. The times he had tried to talk about the future and she had looked away. The times he had noticed her absence and preferred not to confront her. Everything was there, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle he wished he had never put together. And even though he knew he was free now, he felt a kind of emptiness that not even time could fill. Because losing a love is painful, but losing faith in someone who was once your home is like losing part of yourself. The next day, Marcus woke up before sunrise. He walked to a nearby park and stood for hours, staring at the still water of a small lake. His cell phone was still off. He didn't want to be found, or heard, or comforted. He wanted silence. He wanted to see how far his pain could go without exploding. But at that very moment, in another corner of the city, Isabelle was facing a different kind of torment. After the encounter, she began to relive all the choices she had made as if they were sharp knives passing through her memory. His face at the moment she confessed everything would not leave her mind. The way he didn't scream, how he didn't beg for answers, but looked at her as if he would never come back. That killed her more than any scream. Because she realized, too late, that losing Marcus wasn't losing a man. It was losing a certainty, a story, a part of her that only existed with him. She started to avoid the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. That woman who sought independence and novelty now cried alone in the living room, with the lights off, trying to understand when she had become her own enemy. The days passed, and with them, Marcus's image began to appear in places she couldn't control. She dreamed of him speaking calmly, she dreamed of him leaving without looking back. It was always the same ending. Him leaving, her staying. She tried to seek help, she spoke to a therapist, she tried to reorganize things at work. But nothing could fill his absence. Because for the first time, Isabelle understood what true regret was. It wasn't remorse. It was the certainty that what was lost will never come back. And more than that, the anguish of knowing that what was lost, was destroyed by one's own choice. The news that Marcus was involved with another woman reached her like a final shovel of dirt on something that was already buried. A friend from work casually mentioned that she had seen him entering a theater with someone. She said he looked good, smiling, light-hearted. Isabelle didn't know how to react. At first, she wanted to deny it. Then, she tried to downplay it. But in the end, she gave in to the impulse and searched for him on social media. The images were there. They weren't many. But enough. A new woman, a new environment, a new Marcus. More mature, more focused, even more handsome. He had been reborn. And she was stagnant. Overcome by an urgency that not even she understood, Isabelle decided to look for him again. But this time, not to explain herself. Not to ask him back. She just wanted to see him. She needed closure. Something that would end the pain that consumed even what she didn't know she still had. She sent a simple message, without please, I just want to see you. One last time. I won't ask for anything. I won't mess up your life. I just want to look into your eyes and understand how I let this happen. It took Marcus 2 days to respond. And when he did, he was direct. He chose a neutral place, a public space, safe, with no room for drama. A bench at the edge of a garden, where the city seemed to slow down. She arrived first. She was dressed modestly, without makeup. She wore only the truth on her face. When she saw him coming, her heart beat strangely. It wasn't longing, it was respect mixed with regret. He sat next to her, without getting too close. And silence reigned for a few moments. Until she spoke. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, that she just wanted to understand why she felt that, even though she had destroyed everything, she still carried him inside her. He looked at her calmly. He said that love doesn't die when it ends, but when it fades in the other person. He said he felt compassion for her, but that he could no longer put himself where he wasn't seen. She cried. Without shouting, without scandal. Just tears that fell on their own, while she said that now she understood that it wasn't him who was little, it was she who didn't know how to recognize him. She said that she exchanged love for fleeting admiration. And that the worst of all was knowing that he had been the only one who had never failed her. Marcus stood up, took a deep breath, and said in a choked voice that he hoped she found peace. Not for him, but for herself. He said that love should not be begged for, and that now he was where he always deserved to be, in a place where he was seen, heard, and loved. And before leaving, he added, time has not made me forget. It has only made me remember who I have always been. And he left. Isabelle stood there for hours, staring at the ground. She no longer cried. She no longer trembled. She just remained. Because now, for the first time, she was truly alone. No shields, no excuses, no one to blame. And that was the beginning of her greatest lesson. Life had given her a chance, but she refused. Now, all that was left was silence. And in the silence, she would understand everything. The city seemed to follow its normal rhythm while internally everything had changed. After that last meeting between them, there were no more words exchanged, no missed calls, not even an attempt at a disguised reconnection. It was as if that chapter had been written with definitive punctuation. Marcus left that garden not as a man who had won, but as someone who had finally accepted that true victory lay in knowing the right moment to stop fighting. That farewell was not a slammed door, there were no shouts, promises or fake reconciliations. It was a dry, true goodbye, painful enough to transform, and silent enough to echo for a long time within her. He continued his days with a lighter step, but his heart still bore marks. Some nights were still invaded by uncomfortable memories, moments that appeared out of nowhere, like disconnected flashes in a memory that insisted on testing his newly won peace. The woman with whom he was starting something new understood this process. She didn't demand haste, she didn't demand ready-made feelings, she simply offered her presence. What they had was built with patience and respect, on a basis where sincerity came before idealization. It was different. Without grand declarations, but with real gestures. Marcus was still cautious, not out of fear of loving again, but because he understood the value of not giving in on impulse. His heart was now treated like a temple, no longer like a house without doors. He learned, day after day, to trust again, but this time from within himself. The past still knocked on the door at times, but now he knew how to choose when to open up and when to let silence answer for him. Meanwhile, Isabelle was immersed in a process that forced her to face everything she had avoided for so long. The suffering that had previously been denied now came in waves. At work, she still maintained her firm posture, her efficiency intact, her professional smile. But inside, loneliness became increasingly present, not because of the lack of company, but because of the lack of meaning. The man she had been involved with became a faded face, without depth, someone who disappeared in the same shallow way he had arrived. There was no drama, no cinematic ending. Just the end. Reality, stark and raw, showed her that none of it had any substance. He had never been there for her, only for convenience. When the enchantment wore off, all that was left was the echo of choices made without reflection. And now, everything was taking its toll. She started going to therapy more often, not as a way to justify what had happened, but to understand why she had destroyed everything she had sworn to love. The therapist asked her questions she had avoided answering for years. Why had she always felt like she needed more? Why had Marcus's calm love not been enough? Why had she confused stability with boredom? With each session, a layer of her was peeled away, and what emerged beneath was not pretty. It was real. This was the woman who, for the first time, admitted that she did not know how to love without sabotaging herself. That she confused freedom with escape. That, deep down, she had always been afraid of being truly seen. Because when someone saw her, the way Marcus did, she felt vulnerable. And that terrified her more than any absence. Now, she could no longer hide it from anyone, not even herself. Weekends became the worst. The silence of the house, once filled with voices, was now filled with a dense, cutting absence. Every object seemed loaded with meaning. The plants slowly wilted, the books gathered dust, the windows remained closed even on clear days. There was no one to say, "Good morning," to, or to discuss which movie to watch that night. And the most devastating thing was knowing that everything could have been different. She remembered old conversations, small gestures, nights when he would doze on the couch waiting for her. She remembered the notes, the messages at random times, the simple lunches on Sundays. Everything that had once seemed ordinary now hurt to remember. It was as if the value of things had only emerged when they ceased to exist. One day, while walking, she passed by a park and saw a couple smiling as they shared an ice cream. The scene was simple, but it triggered an emotional avalanche in her. She remembered a similar afternoon, years ago, when she and Marcus shared an ice cream and laughed because the wind had knocked the cone to the ground. At the time, they had seemed trivial. Today, they were diamonds that she had let slip through her hands. She sat down on a bench and cried right there, not caring who saw. There were no more masks. There was no more vanity. Only pain. A pain that did not seek solace, only space to exist. It was the price for everything she had denied, for everything she had neglected, for everything she had taken for granted. Marcus, on the other hand, was beginning to experience what it was like to live without looking back. He bought a new bicycle, started visiting book fairs, and started writing again texts that had been forgotten for years in notebooks. The woman who was now with him read his writings, commented with a sparkle in her eyes, and asked questions about his thoughts. This disconcerted him. He was not used to someone who was interested in his inner self without wanting to change it. It was as if he had finally found someone who saw him completely and, even so, chose to stay. The relationship followed its own rhythm, without rushing, without comparisons. It was built on the basis of truth. And for the first time, he felt that he could build something without fear of everything falling apart. The moral dilemma began to present itself subtly. Marcus knew he was rebuilding his life, but part of him still wondered to what extent it was right to move on while the past still cried for him. He felt that, by moving on, he was leaving behind a story that, for a long time, had been his foundation. And even though he had been betrayed, even though he knew he was not the one who caused the destruction, there was still a part of him that wanted to understand why everything had happened. The pain of disappointment was no longer an open wound, but a scar that itched on cloudy days. He wondered if it was fair to find peace while the other party involved was sinking. But he soon realized that compassion is not the same thing as rescue. And that self-love often requires distance. The woman who was now walking beside him realized this dilemma. On a calm afternoon, while they were having coffee in a quiet place, she looked him in the eyes and said that she didn't need promises, but she wanted sincerity. She asked if he still loved Isabelle. Marcus was silent for several seconds. Then, he answered honestly. He said that he loved her very much, deeply, that he would give his life for her if necessary, but that now all he felt was a distant, almost brotherly affection. He said that the love he feels today is different, more mature, more true, because now he loves himself too. And that being with her was not about filling a void, but about discovering new spaces. The woman smiled lightly and held his hand. And in that gesture, he understood that the cycle was truly turning. In another part of the city, Isabelle, faced with her own shadows, began to understand that perhaps forgiveness did not come from outside. That perhaps what she needed, before anything else, was to forgive herself. To stop feeding guilt as a form of punishment and, finally, to accept that making mistakes is human, but growing from them is essential. She began to take small steps. She organized the house. She resumed reading. She wrote letters that she would never send. She stopped looking for Marcus in people's faces. She stopped waiting for time to go back. She began, little by little, to accept that some stories end so that others can begin. And even though she didn't know when yet, she wished, deep down, that one day she could love without destroying. Time, subtle as always, was responsible for repositioning everything. Memories began to settle, feelings found new names, and silence stopped being punishment and became reflection. There was still pain, there were still questions, there were still difficult nights. But now, each of them was following their own path. Paths that would never cross again as before, but that would forever bear the mark of what they were. Their story had no turning back. But it still had something to say. And that something was about to be revealed. On a late afternoon, shrouded by a reddish sky and heavy clouds, Marcus was heading down an unfamiliar path, guided by a feeling he still couldn't name. He had accepted an invitation from a longtime friend to visit a retreat outside the city, in a space dedicated to discussions about purpose and life transitions. He wasn't religious, but he was looking for a kind of reconnection with himself that everyday life no longer seemed to offer. He needed to understand what came after all of this. It wasn't just about Isabelle, or about the new relationship that was now blossoming by his side. It was about the version of himself that emerged after the chaos. The version that survived, but still carried unanswered questions. The journey there was silent. During the hours on the road, he thought about everything he had left behind, but for the first time, not with pain, but with curiosity. Like someone looking at the ruins of an old house and trying to remember what the rooms were like before the fire. He didn't want to rebuild anything from the past. He just wanted to understand. Upon arrival, he was received discreetly. The building was simple, surrounded by tall trees, with few lights and an almost absolute silence, interrupted only by the sound of dry leaves underfoot. He would only be there for 3 days, but he felt as if that time was enough for something to be reorganized within him. On the second day, during a group activity, he was encouraged to write a letter to someone who had left a lasting mark on his life. The blank paper in front of him felt heavier than any other he had ever held. He took a deep breath and began to write to Isabelle. But unlike the words he had once wanted to shout, or those he had wished he would never have to say, this time he wrote with maturity. He told her that he now understood that they had both made mistakes, each in their own way, and that perhaps the biggest mistake of all had been their silence. He said that he no longer blamed her, but that he also had no intention of pretending that nothing had happened. The pain was there. It still was. But now it was just a part of the story, and no longer the whole. He ended by saying that he hoped she would one day be able to truly forgive herself, and that when she did, he hoped she would know how to love like he had tried to teach her. In another part of the city, Isabelle was organizing a new social project in the neighborhood where she grew up. It was a small, voluntary initiative that offered writing and reading workshops for teenagers. The idea had come about after a conversation with her therapist, who encouraged her to reconnect with something genuine. At first, it seemed like just a distraction, but as the weeks went by, she discovered that this space transformed her more than any job had ever done. There, masks didn't work. The young people were sincere, unpredictable, transparent. And she needed to learn how to deal with the other person's truth without hiding from her own. One day, after one of the workshops, a boy asked her what she did when she felt like she had messed up. The question came like a punch. For a moment, she thought about giving a technical, evasive answer. But for the first time, she answered sincerely. She said she was trying to learn not to run away. That sometimes we don't fix things, but we learn to carry on. And that what defines us is not the mistake, but what we do after it. Upon returning from the retreat, Marcus found within himself a kind of serenity that was still new, but solid. He decided that he would not leave any loose ends. He actually wrote that letter he had drafted during the dynamic, rewrote it carefully, and sent it to Isabelle. Not with the desire to reopen anything, but to give her something he considered important, the opportunity to know how he had gotten out of all this. The envelope arrived on a gray day. When she saw the name on the sender, her heart raced. She opened it with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect. She read each line carefully, and at the end, there was no anger or shame. There was gratitude. Because despite everything, he had given her back her humanity. Those words, coming from someone who had every reason to hate her, showed that the love they had experienced had been real. And that, for her, was enough. For the first time, she cried in peace. Weeks later, a local art exhibition brought together people she hadn't seen in a long time. The event was held outdoors, with paintings spread across wooden structures and music playing softly in the improvised corridors. Isabelle was walking among the works when she saw, in the distance, a silhouette she immediately recognized. Marcus was there, accompanied. The woman next to him smiled as she listened to an explanation about a painting. They were calm, as if the world around them no longer held any weight. Isabelle looked away, unhurriedly, without bitterness. Did she feel a pang? Yes. But not jealousy. It was something closer to missing who she was when she was with him. She continued on her way among the works and, moments later, they stopped side by side in front of the same sculpture. He noticed her presence. They looked at each other. Neither of them smiled right away. They just stared at each other with the respect of those who have experienced something immense together. He said a quiet, "Hi," which she responded with a delicate nod. She said she had received the letter. He simply acknowledged it with a gesture. And then there was a brief silence. Then she asked how he was. He said he was fine, and she returned the question. She smiled and said she was too. He said he was happy. She believed him. They looked at the sculpture in front of them, an intertwined metal structure that resembled knots being undone. It was too symbolic to ignore. Isabelle broke the silence and said that now she understood that love is not just presence, it is commitment to the other person's growth. Marcus said he had also learned something, that loving someone is not about canceling yourself for them, but about including yourself in the equation. The conversation lasted no more than 3 minutes. But each word had the weight of a chapter. He said goodbye with a slight smile and returned to the woman who was now part of his life. Isabelle stood there a little longer, watching the movement, feeling the world slowly spin around her. And then she understood that this was closure. A real, sincere and definitive end to a cycle. Not the kind of painful ending that destroys, but the kind that brings peace. She hadn't gone back in time, she hadn't fixed anything, but she had gotten through what seemed impossible. And now, she felt she could continue. She didn't know if she would love again, or when. But she knew that the next time, it would be different. The unexpected, brief, honest and mature reunion sealed what no long conversation could ever achieve. There were no belated apologies or impossible requests. Just recognition. From both sides. The moral dilemma that had been left open found a clear answer there. Sometimes, forgiving someone starts with accepting that they forgave you first. And that perhaps the greatest gesture of love is to let someone go in peace. Even if that means seeing them happy with someone else. Their story ended once and for all at that moment. Not as a tragedy, but as a lesson learned. And it was precisely this ending that paved the way for everything that was yet to come. 2 years had passed since their last reunion, and time had put each piece in its rightful place. The cycle had finally come to an end, but the end was not a sudden cut, it was a transition, profound and definitive, where each decision made had precisely shaped the destiny of everyone involved. Life went on without fanfare, as stories that no longer need to prove anything to anyone tend to do. Marcus now lived in a new reality, completely different from the one in which he had once been torn apart from the inside. The house where he lived was not the same, the neighborhood was different, and so were his habits. But the biggest change was within him. He was a complete man, not because he had forgotten what he had experienced, but because he had understood the value of everything he had endured. He found in the lightness of a new love the serenity that had previously seemed unattainable. A love built on truth, on attentive observation, on the daily choice to remain even when the world was spinning in a hurry. They were not perfect, they had not created an idealized life, but they lived with integrity. They shared plans, dreams, mistakes and successes, and most of all, they shared a silence without discomfort, a silence that said, "Here you can be yourself, and everything is fine." Professionally, Marcus was invited to lead an educational project aimed at at-risk youth, and he accepted without hesitation. He saw a mission there that was greater than the pain he had carried. He became a reference in empathy and emotional reconstruction. He was invited to give lectures, wrote texts that circulated on social media like small breaths of hope, and little by little his story inspired others to leave relationships that no longer made sense, but that were maintained out of fear, convenience, or illusion. He had become living proof that it is possible to get back on your feet, even after losing everything. And perhaps for this reason, there was no longer any resentment in his speech. When he mentioned the past, he did so with the calmness of someone who understood that certain painful chapters are necessary for the book of life to have truth. Isabelle, however, never saw him again after their brief encounter at the exhibition. That image of Marcus next to another woman remained etched in her memory as a permanent reminder of everything that could have been and was not. But contrary to what many might imagine, she did not become a bitter woman. She moved on with her life slowly but surely. She continued with the social project, which grew unexpectedly and became an organization recognized in the city for changing the trajectory of vulnerable teenagers. This new purpose kept her alive. It was there, in direct contact with broken stories, that she found the strength to rebuild her own soul. She taught writing and reading, but more than that, she taught empathy, limits, and talked about emotional responsibility, how to recognize when we are about to hurt someone and how to deal with the effects of the choices we make. Inside, Isabelle was not the same woman who had destroyed a home. She was a version of herself rebuilt from the ruins. She knew she would never get back the love she had lost, and she accepted that as part of the process. She had other relationships after Marcus, but none of them lasted long. Not for lack of opportunity, but because now she demanded from herself a level of truth that she had never had the courage to offer before. She preferred dignified solitude alongside a life with purpose, rather than a comfortable relationship based on conventions. She stopped looking for in others what she should find in herself. She learned to be alone without feeling abandoned. She learned to look in the mirror and say, "I made bad choices, but I am choosing to be better from now on." This clarity was her greatest victory. The man she had cheated on Marcus with moved to another city months after the breakup. He left no trace, no memories. He was just another passing shadow, the kind of person who doesn't stay where there is nothing left to suck. She never tried to contact him again. She never mentioned his name again. It was like a thorn that is extracted with pain, but then the skin heals. Isabelle understood that true forgiveness would never come from Marcus, it would come from her own ability to change course. And in that regard, she succeeded. It was true that she paid a high price, but she used that price as an investment to avoid repeating the same story. One spring morning, while Marcus was organizing a reading circle with young people at a public school, he received an anonymous letter among the event materials. It was handwritten, in a firm handwriting. When he opened it, he recognized it immediately. Isabelle had not signed it, but each word had her voice. In the letter, she said she did not want to reopen any doors, did not want to meet again, or have answers. She simply wanted to say that she finally understood everything he represented. And that, as painful as it had been, he was the great turning point in her life. That thanks to the pain he had caused, she had become a better person. And that she hoped, with all her heart, that he was receiving from someone else what she had once been unable to offer. Marcus smiled as he finished reading. He folded the letter carefully, put it in his briefcase, and went back to work. At that moment, he knew that everything had finally found its place. No pending issues. No resentment. Just maturity. His new love was waiting for him outside with a coffee in his hand and calm eyes. When they met, she noticed something different in his expression. He simply said, "It was a good day." And it was true. And so, the story came to an end. Not the dramatic ending that one expects from tragic tales, nor the romanticized ending of soap operas. But a real ending. An ending where each person reaped what they sowed and, more than that, learned what they needed to learn. Because in the end, love is only valid if it is reciprocal, and betrayal, when it enters, does not just destroy what existed, it kills what could have been. Trust, once broken, does not return with promises. It regenerates itself far away, in new terrains. And sometimes, for us to breathe again, we need to let the other person sink alone into what they chose to live. Now I want to know from you, what did you think of this story? Which character had the biggest impact on you? Leave your opinion in the comments, I really want to know how this story touched you. And of course, if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. This really helps us to continue bringing you meaningful stories that make you reflect, feel, and learn. And finally, remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It breaks trust, erodes love, and hurts what's most intimate about a person. That's why this channel does not support, justify, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Here, the truth comes first. And those who love, respect.